So thank you, Benji, for that somewhat awesome introduction, which gives me a lot to live up to. But thank you more for what the wonderful things you're doing in Moriah and for organizing this fantastic and inspiring and revolutionary program of adult Jewish learning and giving me the tremendous privilege of kicking it off tonight. So the title of my talk is Will We Have Jewish Grandchildren? Which, of course, is really a catchy way of talking about the question of Jewish continuity. What is the future of our community? Where are we going numerically? As I will be saying, that's not the most important thing, but it's an important thing. What is looking at the demographic development of our community here in Australia and indeed in the world? And the question of will we have Jewish grandchildren is an emotional one, but it's also a very real one. Please God, will all the grandparents. I've become a grandfather quite recently, and it's really good, by the way. And the question is, what sort of lives will our grandchildren lead? What sort of lives will our own children give over to their children? What is the future? So about 6 years ago, Monash University in Melbourne, and I think with partners here, produced a survey, a very extensive demographic survey. They called it Gen 08 because it was created in 2008. And person to person, it was probably one of the most extensive surveys of Jewish demography ever done in the world. Since then, last year, we had a major survey that came out of America called the Pew Report, which I'll come to later. The Gen 08 survey produced a vast amount of data, raised a huge number of different issues, and subsequently, year on year, I think it stopped now, but was producing a number of reports as they crunched the numbers in different aspects of the Jewish community and its future. And one of the first that they produced was, in a sense, the most critical one, which is about Jewish continuity. Now, part of the problem with this discussion is data being data can be, data, I'm in Australia, can be read in all sorts of different ways by all sorts of different people. All of whom, including me, have their own personal bias and their own personal agenda. But it seemed to me that basically, however you read it, the picture is looking pretty bleak. Now, intermarriage, and it must be said, is not necessarily the end of the Jewish road. We all know intermarried couples who have raised children with a very strong Jewish identity. There are such families in my school, and I am in awe of their achievement and their dedication, often particularly of the non-Jewish partner, for making that commitment. And the children whom they raise often are very fine and very proud Jewish young people. But we also have to acknowledge that statistically speaking, usually that's not the case. If you look at the data from Australia, and particularly if you look at the data from America, now America is significant because there's a lot more of them, and because we are 10 to 20 years behind. So what happens in America is where we will be in 10 to 20 years. And however you analyze the numbers, you get between 30 and 40% tops of children of intermarried couples who have a strong Jewish identity to the extent that they define themselves as Jewish and want to pass that on to their children. The other 60 to 70%, to varying degrees, do not. So when you bear that in mind, and when you learn that the intermarriage rate in Australia is currently, in the key demographic, the 25 to 35-year-olds, the ones who are married, close to 40%. And if you add cohabiting couples who don't appear in the marriage statistics, you get close to 50%. Indeed, I was talking to the author of the report, Andrew Marcus, Professor Andrew Marcus, only recently, and he said, yes, it's 50%. So if you think that 50% of our young people are choosing to marry or to form partnerships with people who aren't Jewish, and if you realize that only 30-40% of their children are likely to grow up defining themselves as Jewish, that means within 1 or 2 generations, we will approximately halve in size as a community. I'm sorry to say this. It's challenging, it's scary, for some people it's threatening, but it's true. This is the way the numbers are going. And I believe that if we don't change, if this pattern continues, then we're looking at a much smaller Jewish community. Probably a different type of community, but a smaller one. Now, I don't weep for communities changing in size, ebbing and flowing. That's the nature of Jewish life. That's the nature of Jewish history. For 1,000 years, the Jewish centers were on the banks of the Tigris, in places like Sura and Pumbedita for the first millennium, in what is today Iraq, and of which there now remains not a trace. We don't mourn for those places. We literally move on. The time will come when New York is no longer a Jewish center. The time will come, in 100 years, 200 years, 500 years, I don't know, when Sydney and Melbourne will not be Jewish centers. I think there's only one place in the world where we can say the Jewish future is guaranteed, and that's the State of Israel. But I do weep for those individuals whom we are losing, who are disengaging and then disappearing, and missing out on the richness and the opportunities that we think Jewish life gives them. And one actually can see it before one's eyes. One sees young people clearly on the periphery, and then one hears that they have married somebody who's not Jewish, and they're just not there anymore. As I said earlier, there are notable and worthy and very impressive exceptions, but they are the exceptions. It used to be said, as a sort of not very funny joke, what do you call the grandchildren of intermarried couples? The answer is Christians. I actually don't think that's really accurate. What do you call today the grandchildren of intermarried couples, I think more often is, as you often read in the paper about a celebrity or about a politician or whatever, somebody of Jewish origin. Not Jewish themselves, but of Jewish origin. And whenever I come across that phrase, as one often does, I cringe a little bit, because that meant that there was a Jewish line somewhere, and it got broken. And you're left with somebody of Jewish origin. I've actually recently had the privilege of looking at applicants for a certain course in Holocaust studies, mainly from non-Jewish teachers. And it's very interesting to see why non-Jewish teachers want to learn more about the Holocaust so they can teach it for their students. It's a wonderful thing. But a number of the applicants say they want to learn more about the Holocaust because their grandmother was Jewish, because they have Jewish relatives. And I think, what's the backstory there? What happened between the grandmother who was Jewish and the grandchild who clearly is not? Now, in a sense, we've been here before. As a visitor to these shores, and now as a proud Australian, I'm fascinated by the history of my adopted community. And I discovered that around the year 1900, the time of Federation, the Melbourne Jewish community was about 7,000 strong. It was quite active. There had previously been a Jewish day school in the 1880s, so Scopus wasn't the first. And then one wonders, if there were 7,000 Jews in Melbourne in the year 1900, where are their descendants now? Now, we all know a few individuals who can trace their origins back to that time. We all know a few who came on the First Fleet, and they have to admit that they came in chains, which is a bit embarrassing. But there are very few of those. Those 7,000 Jews who lived in Melbourne in 1900, if they had continued to multiply at a constant rate, 2 parents produce 2 children, we would expect to find, give or take some immigration and emigration, 7,000 descendants of them. And yet we don't. They're very, very few and far between. Because in the year 1900, or a little bit later when we got statistics, there was an intermarriage rate of about 30%. Basically what happened to those Jews of Melbourne in the year 1900, to their descendants, is they disappeared. They're not here anymore. At least they're not here as Jews. Why do we still have strong communities? Well, because there have been major waves of immigration, which have buttressed and created much larger numbers, particularly from Europe before and after the war, more recently from Russia, from South Africa. But right now, I don't see a great wave of immigration on the horizon. We have a crisis. And part of the reason we have a crisis is because nobody's talking about it. I'm not the only one, but I'm one of a few who actually says, look at these figures and worry. Look at these figures and ask, where are we going and what are we doing about it? The Generate survey is to me very interesting for what it didn't say, and also for what it did say, but in a very odd way. When I say what it didn't say, is it didn't say why this is an issue. And I looked through it again and again. I used a word search and I used my own eyes. And I was looking, obviously this question that I'm addressing was a major feature in the report. Jewish continuity, intermarriage, numbers in the future. And obviously it was conveying a sort of negative sense that this is a problem. It's bad that up to 50% of our young people are marrying out. It doesn't look good for the numbers. But nowhere did it say why it is bad. It was sort of axiomatic. It is my belief that the reason we are in this crisis is because we don't ask, let alone don't answer that question. And let me explain why. I must say, I've given talks like this to young audiences. And when I get to this bit, where I talk a little bit about relationships, I feel really uncomfortable. Because I'm like old. And I've been wonderfully married for 28 years, so what do I know about relationships? So I have to say the following. I don't believe that many of those 50% who might end up marrying out are planning to do so at this stage. Of course, there are some who say, I've had it with the Jewish community, I want to find something else. There are some. But most people, it doesn't work like that. And I talk to students in my school. I talk to them at the relevant age groups. And most of them say, many of them say, no, I don't plan to marry a non-Jewish person, so I want to marry a Jewish person. But if it so happens that the person who comes along, who turns out to be Mr. Right or Mrs. Right, is not Jewish, well, so be it. And that's what's happening. Because we have a generation of young people who say, yeah, it's a good idea to marry somebody Jewish. But, you know what? It's not the most important thing. And if it turns out that through faith, through love, I end up with somebody else, so be it. And it's that issue which is critical. Because it's not the most important thing. Why isn't it the most important thing? Because we have not managed to explain to our young people, to our children, why actually it is very important. And you'll hear me use this word a lot, because to me the key is making it important. And if a survey produced by the community at tremendous expense, with tremendous resources, can't even ask the question, let alone answer why it's important, well, that explains why we're in the mess that we are. So why might it be important? Well, some people sort of instinctively say that it's good to have lots of Jews. I mean, more Jews is better than few Jews, obviously. As if it's some sort of gigantic popularity contest. The bigger the community, the better we are, or the more right we are. Not only is that nonsense, God says so too. Now, I'm sort of reluctant to speak on behalf of God, but in this particular case, he wrote it in his book, explicitly, Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 7. I do not love you because you are the biggest of nations. In fact, you are the smallest of nations. Former Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sachs is fond of quoting that the number of Jews in the world is smaller than the margin of error in the Chinese census. There aren't a lot of us, and that's always been the way it is, and that's fine. It's not some global popularity contest. And some want to say, well, we need lots of Jews in order to be an effective lobby obliging the government of Australia to support Jewish causes and support Israel. I find that absurd and remarkably self-important. And by the way, if that's the case, we're clearly not working very well, at least as far as the Labour Party is concerned. The idea that the government of Australia makes its decisions just on the basis that there are not very many Jews and they're more rather than less is, I think, shows a remarkable lack of understanding of the political calculations that governments make. And if we ever thought that we had a strong lobby with 100,000 people in Australia, forget it, because we're outnumbered by about 5 to 1 by the Muslims, and that's only going to continue rising. That's not a reason why we need lots of Jews. And then sometimes we're told, I kid you not, we need a large community to keep funding the institutions so the community can keep going. That is a definition of a circular argument. And it doesn't take much to see the absurdity of such an argument. That please stay Jewish so we can carry on staying Jewish. There has to be a better reason than that. And sometimes people say to their children, you should stay Jewish because Jews have suffered for a long time. I don't quite get the logic there either. In fact, if I were trying to sell something to somebody as a good idea, I would play down the suffering bit. And sometimes, particularly in Australia, young people are told, you must stay Jewish because your great-grandparents suffered in the Holocaust. Again, I understand a little bit of the emotional pull, but you have to understand it from the idea of the recipient. The logic to that position is completely lacking. Why my choice of marriage partner should be determined by the fate suffered by my great-grandparents, why I should restrict myself and not go out with that girl or that boy because of what happened in Poland, actually makes no sense whatsoever. And sometimes people say, including people in jobs like mine, say, well, it's been going for 3,000 years, so we should keep going. To which I'm tempted to say, who still uses an iPhone 3? Right? We're in an age where old is not so good. New is better. Again, if I'm trying to sell something, I don't necessarily say it's really, really old. So to be honest, we're often left with no reasons at all. Either we don't even ask the question, or we give pretty useless answers. And so our young people, when they're deciding what's important, is this issue important enough to affect whom I'm going to choose as my life partner? They don't get that answer. They don't have a reason for making it important enough. There's a phenomenon which is often said of graduates of Moriah, graduates of Scopus, that they come out Jewed out. They've been in school for 15 years, and they've been so over-Jewed, they're Jewed out. And they want to get away. They go to university, they go to the workplace, they rush into every non-Jewish activity, sometimes they rush into the arms of non-Jewish people. I have to say, I used to be very critical of this position. I used to say the following, that if I were to binge on chocolate, which occasionally I do, I would have to be honest and say to myself, I'm doing it because I like the chocolate. I wouldn't come up with a pathetic excuse to say, well, I've had the healthy eating messages for 15 years and it's driven me into the chocolate binge. That doesn't make sense. However, on reflection, I actually think there's a little bit more to this position. Because if we tell our young people, you must be Jewish, you must stay Jewish, you must mix with Jewish people, you mustn't romantically get involved with non-Jewish people, but we don't tell them why, we just tell them what they have to do without underpinning it with a reason, then I'm actually a bit more sympathetic to them to say, well, as far as I'm concerned, I'm Jewed out. You haven't given me a basis for this major restriction on my life that you're trying to impose upon me. So what is the answer? What is the magic phrase that we can say to our children that will guarantee Jewish grandchildren, that will make everything all right, that will stop the crisis? We could say that being Jewish is the bearer of 3,000 years of values and heritage. And these values are unique and special. We could say that the Jewish people discovered monotheism. That's important. What does it mean to say that we have one God? Why do we talk about it so often? Why do we say Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad? And I think the answer is this. Because in the ancient world where there were lots of different gods, it was very easy to find a God who, by amazing coincidence, matched your own lifestyle. The Romans had gods of thieves. The Romans had gods of adulterers. They were pretty much all adulterers, I think the gods were. The Roman gods weren't very nice, and that's great, because if you're not very nice, you can find a god who matches you. You can create God in the image of yourself. When there's only one God, you don't have that option. When there's only one God, you have to be in God's image, and that's quite a lot to live up to. That's what monotheism means. That's a gift that we gave to the world, and that we continue to extol daily. We could say that Judaism believes in the idea of personal responsibility. Maimonides says that the underpinning of Jewish philosophy is the idea of bechira chofshit, of free choice. That we always have the choice whether to do this or to do that, whether to do right or wrong, or more often more right or less right. And that's not just an interesting idea. It means we must take responsibility for our actions. We can't blame someone or something else. That's a powerful idea to make us better people. We can say that Judaism gave the idea of tzedakah, which is often translated as charity, but actually means justice and righteousness, because supporting vulnerable people, helping the poorer members of our community and indeed of the world, is not just an act of charity, it's an act of what we have to do. And perhaps that's why at the forefront of every every social and political movement arguing for social justice have been Jews, from anti-apartheid to civil rights, even to communism, and rejecting the exploitation that existed in the old regimes. It's often been led by Jews because we come with this passion for social justice, for righting wrongs. And so on, and so on, and so on. But I don't think that's a good enough answer. I don't think it's an effective answer. And for one thing, there's a sort of practical problem. Because, of course, other people, non-Jewish people, have fine values as well. We don't have a monopoly on goodness. Absolutely not. One can also say, if the young person is responding, well, you know what? I can maintain those values, whomever I marry, whatever sort of family I raise. I can still be a good person by all those criteria. And that's absolutely true. There was something the Gen 08 survey said, which I would describe as bizarre. Because it actually said, we know what the answer is. It said there is a very clear correlation between Jewish practice, between the level of Jewish actions in one's life, and the mitigating the effects of one's children marrying out, or promoting Jewish continuity. The correlation is like the number one in statistical terms. And then it said, but of course that won't apply to us. Of course that's not realistic. Let's think of something else. Put another way, the Pew report that analysed America last year again came to the same conclusions on a larger scale. If you do Jewish things, your children are more likely to stay Jewish. If you don't do Jewish things, your children are less likely to stay Jewish. It's as simple as that. We're not talking about 100% guarantee. There's no such thing. We're talking about improving the chances. And if you want to know the one tried and tested technique which has ensured Jewish continuity for hundreds and thousands of years, it's doing Jewish things. Nothing else has ever succeeded. So I don't stand before you promoting this idea because, like I'm principal of a Jewish school. I stand before you saying Jewish actions promote Jewish continuity because that's the truth. Because that's clearly proved statistically and historically. And so, the answer to the question of what do we say to our children in order to ensure, at least maximize the chances of Jewish continuity, in order to maximize the chances of having Jewish grandchildren? Well, the answer is it's not about saying. That's the wrong question. I can say what I've just said about Jewish values. I can say that to me, being Jewish and living a Jewish life is meaningful, it's beautiful, and it represents some profound truth. But that won't do it. It's not what we say, it's what we show. It's what we show our children. And we have to show our children that being Jewish and maintaining Jewish life is important. It's very important. Because to me, that's the key to ensuring that they will make the right choices. If they understand that it's important. So how do we show it's important? So I'd like to suggest a 5-point plan. To learn, to do, to commit, to connect, and to love. So let me start with learning. We've all seen the film Fiddler on the Roof. It's a great film. About Jewish continuity, by the way. And we all know the character of Tevye as he has his chats with the camera. And he says things like, I'm tempted to do the Chaim Topol voice, but I won't. He says things like, you may ask, why do we wear little hats? Why do we wear fringes on the corners of our clothes? And I will tell you, he says, I don't know. But I can answer the question in one word. And we all know the word. And he breaks into song, and the song is tradition. That's his answer. Well, thank you very much, scriptwriters, film producers, to reduce 2,000 years of Jewish scholarship to, I don't know. Incidentally, the Tevye in the book, in Shalom Aleichen's original book, even though Shalom Aleichem was a Bundist, was a profound secularist, he would have answered the question. Because Tevye in the book was a Talmud Chacham, he was a scholar. He quotes verses and Mishnayot and rabbinic literature left, right, and center. Tevye in the film goes, I don't know. You know what? I know. I know why I wear fringes on the corners of my garments. Because in the book of Numbers, chapter 15, there's a mitzvah from God to do so. And that's discussed further in the Gemara in Menachah, explains the details thereof. And that's brought down in the Shulchan Aruch, in the Code of Jewish Law, and expounded further by subsequent commentators. If Tevye wants to know why he wears tzitzit, he doesn't have to sing a song. He has to go out and learn. Because when he learns, he will understand. But this is not some absurd ritual which is tradition because Grandpa used to do it. It's part of how we serve God in this world. Jewish rituals are not rituals. They are not queer, quaint customs which we've adopted with no reason why. They're part of a system. They're profound. They make sense. And because they're profound and make sense, they become important. And we live in an age where accessing Jewish learning has never been easier. We live in an age where all the major Jewish texts are available in translation with annotations. They're suddenly accessible in a way they've never been before. We live in an age where the internet delivers shiurim and high-quality Jewish learning over the wire straight into our computer or our phone or our iPad in our own hands, anytime, any place. And we live in an age where our community organizes adult education programs like this and many others in different places. And we no longer have an excuse to be ignorant. We no longer have to say, if indeed we ever did, I don't know, but it's tradition. We can say, you know what? That's a good question. I'd like to find out. I'd like to understand more. I'd like to access more the richness and the profundity and the truth of what it means to be Jewish and why I do what I do. And there are many things which one still might not understand. But at least one will understand that there is such a system and it does make sense, even if I can't quite perceive and work it out right now. There is a crucial difference between saying, I don't know it's tradition and singing a song, and saying, I'd like to find out. And I'm going to enjoy the exercise of finding out. And I'm going to share that with my family. So learn. Learn and learn. I think it was Mark Twain who said, there's nothing worse than a stupid Jew. Because to be Jewish means to be learned. Because only when one is accessing learning on a level, a low level, a high level, any level, does one begin to get some sort of intellectual basis for what we do. Without that learning, Tevye is right. And the children who turn their backs on Jewish life are right. It's all a bit of weird customs and I'm better off without. But with learning, it's something much, much more real, much more true, and hence much more important. And the next thing on my list is do. Now, I've already said that statistically, those who do more Jewish things are more likely to ensure Jewish continuity in subsequent generations. But there's a good reason why. Because I talked earlier about the values that we have. Our approach to those values is not to leave them as abstract ideas on paper or in some lofty speech, but to translate them into action. We talk about the idea of freedom. And you know what? Once a year, we eat funny tasting carbony bread for a week. We sit down around a Seder and we talk to our children, and our grandparents talk to our grandchildren, and we eat the very stuff to remind us of what the Exodus was. We don't just talk about freedom, we act it out. We articulate it through actions. We don't just talk about freedom in another sense. Once a week, we have a day when we cease to show our mastery over nature. And at the same time, we cease to let all that stuff around us show its mastery over us. One day a week, we withdraw from all that so that we can be neither masters nor slaves. We can be human beings. We can interact with our family, with our friends, with our community, with our God. We call that Shabbat. And it gives an actual meaning to this idea of being free and being human. We think that personal reflection is a good idea. We think it's a good idea to sometimes take stock of who we are and what we're doing. And so what we do is we dedicate a special time of year called Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and we talk about the idea of teshuvah, of repentance, of confession, of facing up to who we are, and we dedicate our whole time and we say, let's do it. We believe in strong families. We think that's a nice idea. We celebrate Jewish families. We love the fact that families often cross generations, and that is one of the secrets of our strength. But how does families become strong? Under the chuppah, we say a blessing. We say the birchat erusin. We say God who has permitted those whom we're permitted to and forbidden those whom we're forbidden to. We have a concept of sexual ethics, which I think is the basis for our families being strong. Again, it's not just a good idea. We translate it into action. If we leave these abstract ideas as abstract ideas, they won't be real. We can say, be a good person, look after other people. But unless we say, that means give a certain proportion of your income to tzedakah, actually hand over the money, put the coins in the pushka, find people who you can help, find ways that you can volunteer, and do it, then the idea is meaningless. That's what mitzvot are. Mitzvot are ways of taking ideas and making them real. But that brings me to my third point, which is commit. Now let me say at this point, some of you might be thinking, is he telling us we have to do every mitzvah, and if we don't, it's all lost? Because that ain't going to happen. No, I'm definitely not saying that. That's not realistic, and it's probably not a good idea. Nobody should be making sudden jumps. Nobody should feel ever that in Judaism it's all or nothing, because it absolutely isn't. But it should be something. It should be something that is non-negotiable. Let me tell you what I mean. And let me give you a parable which we can all relate to ourselves, perhaps in different situations and different contexts, but I believe every one of us can relate to it in one way or another. But let me give you the story of many, many families in our communities for whom Friday night is very important. Undoubtedly, they would sit round the table, parents, grandchildren, grandparents, do the kiddush, do the challah, and it's a very, very important part of the week, and it's beautiful, and it's real, and it's Friday night. Shabbat, we know, actually lasts for 25 hours, but not everyone fulfills it for all that time, and for many, many people, Friday night is very important, and that's wonderful. And they would never miss a Friday night. Unless, if you'll pardon the Melbourne reference, unless Carlton are playing at the MCG on Friday. In which case, that's the time that they would miss the Friday night dinner. Now, what are they saying at that point? They're saying the following. Friday night dinner, Shabbat with the family, is very important. But Carlton playing is more important. That's what they're saying. And it's absolutely crystal clear that they're saying that, because Carlton trumps over the Friday night dinner. Now, let's work out what this means. I don't say Carlton trumps, they don't do that very often, but they trump the Friday night dinner. Let's see what that means. They're saying to their children, Friday night dinner is very important. It's probably one of the most important things of Judaism. But a footy match is more important than that. That means nothing in Judaism is more important than a footy match. And certainly, it means we can't ask our children to make sacrifices for being Jewish. We can't ask our children to impose any sort of inconvenience on themselves for the sake of being Jewish. And we certainly can't ask our children to determine their life partner for the sake of being Jewish. Because how important is Judaism to their parents? Less important than who plays football on Friday night. Now, I want to stress that this applies to all of us. For some people, going to shul 3 times a day is very important, unless they have a meeting in the evening, which means they can't do that. For some people, learning Torah for an hour a day is very important, unless they're too tired. We all have that unless. And every time we make that unless, then we're actually defining our priorities. And that's why it's a very important decision. And that's why it is so crucial that something that we do should be non-negotiable, however inconvenient, however many competing interests, competing priorities. Because unless we find one thing in our Jewish life that trumps and triumphs over everything else, then we are saying that nothing is really important enough. So that's something I would say to you. I would say to all of us. Find at least one thing and make it more important than anything else. And the next thing is to connect. Connect to what? Connect to other Jews. We often are faced with a certain conundrum. Sometimes we like to debate it. And the conundrum is this: are we Australian Jews? Are we Jewish Australians? What does that mean? You know, to be honest, I feel we've spent a bit too much time on this question. You're right, it's a bit of a conundrum, but, you know, we live with it. At our functions, we sing Advance Australia Fair, and we also sing Hatikva. In shul, we say the prayer for Australia, and we also say the prayer for Israel. It works. Okay? Bob Carr might have a problem with it, but as far as I'm concerned, it works. But what this is really saying is, wherever we are, whatever country we live in, we have a connection to something called, well, it's hard to know what it is to be called. It's not a Jewish race, because of course we're not all bound by racial characteristics. It's not just a Jewish religion, because of course many people are proud Jews without being religious. So the best we can probably call it is the Jewish people. A concept which perhaps is unique to us, the concept of peoplehood. Now, of course, it's actually very relevant to our question, because when one doesn't continue to be engaged with Judaism and Jewish life, one is essentially leaving the Jewish people. But apart from that, it's one of those things that actually we need to show our children is part of being Jewish. That we connect to other Jews around the world. When other Jews are in distress, we share their pain. When other Jews are celebrating, we're part of their joy. And in particular, we connect to that one place which is the crucible of Jewish life and Jewish destiny in our time, that one place for which we are so thankful to see the rebuilding in our days, the state of Israel. And we identify and connect to the people and the state and the land. And before we sit down and analyze and intellectualize what is our connection to Israel, we start with that sense of connection and that sense of love. Because we are bound to Israel, because it's the center of life of the Jewish people, and we are part of the Jewish people. Yes, it's a conundrum. Does it really make sense? What is this concept? Don't worry about it. Just feel it. And you know, it's under threat. Increasing numbers of young people are disconnecting from Israel. We see this very clearly in America, and we see it if we look in the right places here in Australia. And remember, what happens in America is where we will be in 10 to 15 years' time. What's interesting is what you hear often is people saying, we're disconnecting from Israel because we don't agree with what Israel's doing. Occupied territories, this, that, and the other, and the legal settlements, these things that we hear. That's why we're disconnecting from Israel. I maintain that in most cases it's the other way around. Because some of our young people are either unaware of or embarrassed by this concept of being part of the Jewish people because it's old-fashioned, it's primitive, it's tribal. Therefore, they feel that disconnect from the Jewish state, and only then is everything that's said about Israel suddenly takes root in their opinions, and then they tell us how they're disconnecting from the state of Israel, which they think is politically acting improperly. But let me put it a different way. I don't know so many people here, but I would guess that when people like us, when we read the Sydney Morning Herald, when we turn on the ABC, and we see that drip, drip, drip effect of anti-Israel news, I reckon most of us would say, what's the complete picture? Maybe the Fairfax Press is only giving us part of the story, maybe there's a lot more. And then what some of us do is we go to the Jerusalem Post, we go to the Times of Israel, we go to various other news sites, we speak to our family in Israel, we get a bigger picture. Whereas others, including members of our own community, don't do that. And I don't want to get into a whole political discussion, but I think I think most people would agree that there is often a one-sided reporting of things from Israel, whereas many people will see that one-sided reporting from Israel and will conclude that's the whole story. What is it that motivates many of us to look further and not take these things at face value? And the answer is because we start from a connection, a sense of being connected to Israel. We start from a sense of loving Israel. We start from a sense of knowing deep down that Israel is not a monster. Israel is actually a wonderful place. And Israel, by the standards of other nations, if they were suffering from the same sort of challenges and ongoing wars that Israel is suffering from, would fare a lot worse in the morality stakes. We know that. We know that because we have that sense of connection to Israel and to the Jewish people. And that's a crucial part, an integral part of what it is to be Jewish. And if our children grow up without that sense, they're missing out on so much, and they're missing out on why being Jewish and being part of the Jewish people is important. And finally, on my list of what we can do to improve our chances, what we must do in order to make living Jewish a reality, the last item on my list is love. I don't mean loving children, that goes without saying. That's for another talk, and of course, we shouldn't take it for granted, but of course it's absolutely critical. I'm talking about loving being Jewish. Now, I reckon many people would say, yeah, of course I love being Jewish. But let's talk about it a bit more. Let's tell our kids how much we love being Jewish. You know, we're Jews, we're really good at complaining. We complain about the price of kosher food. We complain about the school fees. We complain about the school, I don't know why. We say that people in Israel are rude, and we say that there's too many things that the shul requires us to do, and don't get me started on second day Yom Tov. We just complain about all sorts of things. And, you know, of course that's fine because it's amongst friends. We know deep down we love Judaism. Well, the trouble is, the people hearing us moan and whine learn differently, and particularly our children. Rav Moshe Feinstein, the great rabbi who lived in America until the 80s, had a famous comment answering the question, the historical question, why was it that when you look at the generation of Jews who came as immigrants to New York around the turn of the last century, and they're the ones about whom we hear the stories, how they struggled to maintain the Jewish life that they brought with them from Eastern Europe. They were the ones who found work in the sweatshops and were told by the bosses, if you don't turn up for work on Saturday, then don't bother coming back for work on Monday. And you know what? They didn't turn up for work on Saturday, and they looked for other work on Monday. And Rav Moshe was asked, why was it that despite the tremendous sacrifice, many of their children didn't follow in the same path? They became non-observant, or completely secularized, or not Jewish. And he answered it as follows, because yes, those people made tremendous sacrifices, but often, and of course we're generalizing, they did it with a sigh and with a cry of how difficult it was. And the children didn't see the sacrifice, but they just heard the cry, and they heard the sigh, and they learned how difficult it was. I guess we're here tonight because we love being Jewish. It's important to us. We need to tell other people how much we love it. And of course it's not perfect, and Jewish life isn't perfect, and the Jewish community isn't perfect. Well, it's pretty good. But it's not perfect. We know that, but we don't have to say it all the time. And in particular, we don't have to say it to our children. I said earlier, there are no guarantees. I want to make absolutely clear that I'm not saying that everyone who brings tremendous amount of Jewish life into their lives is guaranteed to have Jewish grandchildren. It doesn't work like that. And we all know families who work so hard to instill a Jewish identity, and yet it doesn't work. And we also know the converse. We know strong Jewish young people have come from families which haven't given them such a strong Jewish input. Of course there are no guarantees, there's no statistical certainties. But there is statistical likelihood. We're living in times of crisis. We as a community need to wake up. We need to scream at each other, we need to scream at our leaders, there's a crisis, we need to do something about it. In my opinion, the reason for this crisis is because we're not aware of the crisis and because we don't tell our young people how important it is for them to build Jewish life for themselves, to build Jewish life for others, and to create Jewish lives for the future. If we can show them that Jewish life is important to us, it's something about which we can learn, it's something for which we can bring actions into our daily lives, it's something for which we can make commitments to some things which are non-negotiable. It's something that connects us to Jewish people around the world and to Israel. And it's something that we love for ourselves. Then we can change the balance. We can help our children to make the right choices, not by lecturing them, but by showing them. The Jewish story has been told for a long time. I said earlier, just because it's been going for 3,000 years does not in itself make it a good story. But you know what? It is a good story. It's a great story. It's a story of a people who've battled against tremendous odds, physically, politically, numerically, and have carried on because of what we believe in. Because we believe our way of life is good and beautiful and meaningful and true. If we can show that to our children, then we have a chance that this song that has been sung, this story that's been told for 3,000 years, will be told for many generations to come, ultimately to eternity. Thank you very much.